Hello everyone, you got the graveyard shift about to start, so hopefully we can get through this. So today I'll be presenting about flywheel training for developing hamstring strength. Flywheel training is something that I've been focusing on for 4 years, 5 years. I'm doing my PhD on it as well with Marco. So it's something that I'm quite passionate about, but I'll try and be concise and I'll try and be really clear. So hopefully this gives us some outcomes. This is what I'd like to talk about. So what is flywheel training? Why should we bother strength training the hamstrings? What we test and how we train. So this is what usually we do. Finally, our question and methods, and final thoughts or conclusions from this study, which I did, which was a part of my PhD. So initially, what is flywheel training? Excuse the facials, I try my best. Here we have a flywheel squat, but the concept of flywheel training applies to every exercise we do. We try to perform high intensity resistance training, which involves spinning a wheel during the concentric phase and then resisting whatever energy we generate in the eccentric phase. So this is me then performing and breaking the energy that I generated in the first part. Obviously, this might be a little bit complicated, but 3 things that we mainly look to manage with flywheel training, and that's changing moments of inertia or intensity, changing volume, so obviously like we would do with normal weights, and changing the way we perform the exercise. So what's one thing that's very common in the literature is to perform a delayed and maximal braking. So in the eccentric phase, decelerating the weight or the movement right towards the end of the range of motion. This should generate something called an eccentric overload. So we hear the word eccentric overload being associated with flywheel training all the time, but that's not necessarily the case. I'm not going to sit here and talk about that, but it's important that we mention that flywheel training is not eccentric training. Flywheel training is not eccentric overload training. Flywheel training is just flywheel training, unfortunately. If you want more information on flywheel training, we can, there's this paper that Marco and I wrote on Sportsmith, which hopefully captures all of flywheel training very, very simply, if you are interested. If not, then don't worry. Background, why should we bother training the hamstrings? So the hamstrings are very important in sport. So I work in football for maximal speed. So this is a conversation I would have with the coach. Why do we do this? Important to improve maximal speed and our ability to repeat high intensity actions like high speed running, etc., etc. Importantly, we train the hamstrings to also try and reduce risk of hamstring injury. Hamstring injuries are very common, and once you injure your hamstring, the chances of you re-injuring your hamstring are quite high, and in fact they increase. And we know through a lot of data that actually issues can persist for years after an initial hamstring injury. So it's not like, oh, pop my hamstring, a couple of years down the line, you'll be fine. It's more than likely that actually that's going to be a problem for a long period of time. And as we showed, as Alex showed earlier, you keep getting references. You did a good job. Hamstring injuries cost a lot of money, and this cost continues to increase. Hamstring injuries have a very big effect on performance, both from a player perspective, so maximal speed that they're able to achieve, but also from a team's perspective. So this is not just about hamstrings, this is all injuries. The more injured you are, the less likely your team is going to perform well. It's a kind of a logical conclusion. And finally, obviously, athlete health. So I put an ambulance here, it's a bit dramatic, but hopefully it gets the point across that if you get a hamstring injury, it's a bit of a red flag. It's a bit of a problem for yourself, but for any team that wants to buy you or wants to train you in the future if you are an athlete. So it's very important that we try and avoid hamstring injuries. Right, so okay, we've established that hamstring injuries are a problem. Big problem, oh no. So what do we do to try and manage hamstring injuries? We have non-modifiable risk factors like age, which we can't really do anything about, and we also have modifiable risk factors like strength. So eccentric strength, ooh, buzzword, is something that's very important and something that we test often. So here we have a lab-based method of testing, the Biodex, and here we have the Nordboard, which is from Vald, who are also here, do a very good job. So these 2 methods are a great way to manage hamstring injury risk, but also manage hamstring strength, which are kind of related. There are obviously other things that we can do to try and manage hamstring injury risk and performance. There are other methods of testing, and these can be done with the Biodex, with the force plates from Vald. There's loads of different things that you can do, including bodyweight strength endurance exercise tests. So you can go and do a unilateral exercise to fatigue and see if there's a difference between the left and the right leg. So this is something that we might see in clinic if we don't have access to a lot of equipment or we don't have expensive things. We can also use the flywheel, which is something that we can maybe measure over time during training, which kind of facilitates testing. But really, we don't have an established way of doing that. So people kind of pull things together and do a bit of everything. So there are a few question marks around, well, what should we be testing? How often should we be testing? How reliable is the data that we're using? But we'll leave that for a second and we'll go over to how we train the hamstrings. We train the hamstrings using this very simple exercise developed 100 years ago. It's a knee-based exercise, so we're just going to use two terms, knee-based and hip-based. It's a knee-based exercise that sure seems to be very effective. You know, it improves hamstring strength, may reduce injury risk. Fantastic. But actually, that's not what's happening. We see hamstring injury risk is increasing. We see the cost associated with hamstring risk increasing. So we developed other tools to try and reduce hamstring injury risk and improve hamstring strength. Here we have a glute ham raise, which is a hip-based method. And you can apply this with isometric, eccentric, or just concentric and eccentric exercises to complement your Nordic training or your sprinting. So trying to look a little bit more holistically at what we do, maybe we can tackle hamstrings with different exercise and different machines. So it's not just about doing Nordics or flywheel training, but maybe it's a combination of Nordics, flywheel training, and sprinting that's going to be the solution. Here we saw a study that's now 20 years old, and it was a very simple study, a 10-week bilateral flywheel leg curl intervention consisting of 16 sessions that improved concentric and eccentric strength of professional Swedish soccer players. Now this study has been cited a load of times, and it actually has the title eccentric overload, maybe a little bit of a bugbear of mine, but it actually used flywheel training. So they used this device here, and it's sort of been replicated throughout the literature, and it's shown that actually bilateral hamstring curls are effective for enhancing strength, and they may reduce likelihood of injury. More recently, there are hip-based variations of flywheel training that train the hamstrings. So here you see myself, I tried to blur it, but if you can see it, unfortunately, I'm sorry. Me doing an RDL, so a Romanian deadlift, which is a hip-based, once again, hip-based exercise. And this has been investigated more recently in the literature. And we see, oh, actually, that improves hamstring strength as well. So this led us to our question of, well, if we have these methods that work, are they being applied in literature? We found that actually, yes, these exercises are being applied, but now practitioners are starting to work towards other variations. They're starting to do other things. So they're no longer just doing hamstring exercises that are based on the knee or on the hip. They're starting to combine the two. And rather than doing bilateral exercises, they're starting to do unilateral exercises, which asks the question, is it the same thing? Do we get the same outcomes? Nobody knows. So what we wanted to do after we did an initial investigation on the reliability of these measures, we actually looked at the unilateral hip extension exercise, you might see this photo a few times, and the unilateral leg curl exercise. And we found that these two exercises do not respond unanimously to changes in load. So if we increase the inertia or the intensity of the exercise, the leg curl, in terms of peak power, appears to stay relatively similar, whereas we have quite significant changes with the hip extension. So this provided some guidelines for us in this investigation to try and understand, well, how the bloody hell do we actually periodize this training? What do we do? What do we do in a 6-week intervention? Do we increase the inertia for both exercises at the same time? Do we start with one a bit lower and one a bit higher? This was quite instrumental for us in terms of developing the protocol. Here's what we actually did. So the use of flywheel training for developing hamstring strength. We tracked over, so I've just simplified it to 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 training sessions over a 6-week period. And we trained one leg with both exercises, and the other leg just did whatever they wanted, apart from any strength training. So we controlled for that. They just went about their daily life, and they came in to the lab. They trained twice a week with these exercises. What we saw was that at 30 degrees, so a lengthened state, there was no change in isometric strength. So after 6 weeks of unilateral hamstring training, twice a week, there was no change in isometric strength. And this was the protocol that we used. So we did it at 30 degrees on the bidex, and we performed 2 repetitions that both lasted 3 seconds. You can see here the control group, so did not train and did train. There was no statistical difference. Importantly, we also looked at the eccentric capacity, because we know that that's important for, according to the evidence, risk of injury and also probably performance. Once again, at 60 degrees per second, so a very slow movement with a good amount of reliability, a valid test of strength, we saw no change in hamstring strength. So we're using a high-intensity resistance training method, yet we've not achieved a change in one of our primary outcomes, strength. Very weird. What we did find was that in the hip extension exercise, there was a large significant increase in concentric force, or concentric power, rather, peak power, and a large increase in eccentric peak power. Ooh, a few eyebrows have raised. What we saw, once again, was that there was a similar story for the leg curl. So we saw an improvement in flywheel-specific measures, but we did not see an improvement in bidex, so slow, very slow, or isometric changes in strength. And this is, once again, just to reiterate that point, it highlights maybe an interesting concept around what we measure and actually what we give importance to at different stages of rehabilitation, at different stages of physical preparation. Because if we use a test at the very beginning of an intervention where we train mostly isometrically, we're likely to see changes in isometric strength because of the way we train. Concluding, hopefully, we actually know that now we're starting to see more and more that if you train a specific capacity in that position, so if you train on the bidex, you're going to improve your bidex strength. If you train this, you're going to improve this. It starts to seem quite maybe too simple. But our final thoughts at, okay, sure, these are the conclusions we've drawn, but what does the literature say? Unfortunately, there's only been one study that looked at this, and this was quite recent, a group over in Australia. They did a similar intervention of 6 weeks. Ours was a lot more volume. They found that with one leg being, so they had no control group, with one leg training unilaterally with a lighter load, and one leg training with 2 legs on the way up, so both legs in the concentric phase and 1 leg in the eccentric phase. So we call this an eccentric overload in theory. To be fair, it is because of the values that they achieved. They found no changes in strength. So they trained both legs, and both legs, obviously the analysis was a pre to post analysis with no real control group, so maybe there were some limitations in terms of the strength of the data. They also found no changes, which in my opinion is quite interesting. Here we have a unilateral isometric weighted hip extension like this with a hold there. So they would hold this position for 5 seconds. They also found no changes in eccentric strength after a 6-week intervention. Here we have our famous Nordics, which after a 10-week intervention found no change in eccentric strength. And here we have the traditional resistance training, so barbell weights at 75% of 1 RM. Compared to Nordic hamstring exercises in rugby players, also found no change in eccentric strength. So all of a sudden we're starting to look at this perfect narrative of, well, you do strength training and you'll improve strength. Fantastic, everyone can go home. Actually, no. It seems to be that regardless of the types of ways that you train, whether it's hip-based or knee-based or dynamic or eccentric or isometric, you are not guaranteed these outcomes. It's probably a little bit more complicated than that. And to add to the confusion of the literature, we have seen some interventions lasting a little bit longer with a large variation of repetitions being effective for the Nordics. We have seen eccentric only hip-based exercises being effective with only short interventions. And we have seen, like we mentioned earlier, a study that showed 20 years ago that flywheel training works with 512 repetitions after 10 weeks of training, that you can improve eccentric strength. So what I want to highlight here is there's a bit of inconsistency in the literature. Our study suggested that there's no change in eccentric or isometric strength, but that wasn't the first study to show this. And actually, if we look at the greater overall literature in terms of strength training, you're not guaranteed these outcomes. There's probably a few things that you need to be doing right, which upon reflection, we're now starting to say, well, actually, we should have done that, but that is hindsight for you. So one of the things that we sort of very basically realized was maybe we need to train them for a bit longer. We chose 6 weeks because this is typically what you would expect in terms of preseason, or what you might expect in terms of rehabilitation of an athlete after hamstring injury before they might go out onto the pitch. So we decided to choose a time frame that was realistic with regards to, well, how long would you have to train the athlete to improve their strength? But realistically, we might need 10 weeks. That's our ultimate conclusion. You can all go home. But we also realized that intensity and progressive overload are probably key. And this is for the simple reason that with a higher amount of intensity, you're able to elicit a higher peak force, which would then translate to better strength adaptations. So, we started to ask ourselves, have we used, our moments of inertia? Is our intensity too low? Did we progress the exercise intensity in the right way? Looking back, like I said, hindsight's a great thing, but maybe we didn't. Maybe we didn't do a good job. So here what we have is we have the intensity increasing slowly but surely, but for a prolonged period of the protocol for 4 weeks, we used what some might consider not a very high moment of inertia. And the previous study that we showed, the unilateral exercise protocol that we showed earlier, also did a similar thing. They didn't really change anything for a prolonged period of time. And so that kind of begs the question. Maybe it's not that flywheel training doesn't work. Maybe it's just that we're not training them hard enough. I don't know if anyone wants to hear that, whether it's the athlete or us. But that might be one reason why we didn't see the changes that we wanted to see. The other thing to consider is maybe the actual volume within the session. So the only study that did show an improvement in eccentric hamstring strength with the Biodex used 24 repetitions per session. This was the bilateral one that I mentioned earlier that was 20 years ago. In our study, we thought we'd do 48 to 64. So depending on the volume, as you saw there, we went from 3 sets, and then we went up to 4 sets to try and increase the demand. That was actually probably too much, not very effective. In the previous study, the other unilateral exercise, or the other unilateral flywheel study, they used more than 30 repetitions per session for 4 weeks. So for a prolonged period of time, they actually used quite a lot. So maybe we need to be training less on the day and just increasing the exposure. So once again, these guys went for 10 weeks and they did 24 repetitions per session, whereas we did for 6 weeks, and everyone was above 30 repetitions for quite a long period of time. There we go. So in support of this, when volume increased, so in the week that we increased volume to 4 sets, we saw a large variation in how people responded. So we tracked their peak power outputs, concentric and eccentric during every session, and we saw this change, which is fantastic. But when we immediately added 1 set, what we saw was that there was a massive difference in people's ability to cope with the eccentric demand of the exercise. And so if we're training maximal eccentric strength, maybe we need to be careful about how we administer that dose and what we consider around it. So concluding, excessive volume may not be a good idea, and it probably is important to focus on the intensity rather than that. I know it's been quite negative, so just wanted to add this on there. It's not all that bad, so don't worry, it's okay. We can and we have probably trained something else in the hamstring that is important. And you can see that here through the results because we got quite big changes in both eccentric knee-based and eccentric hip-based power, which obviously might not be the exact same thing as strength, but it's also important to consider how we tested it. So we tested it using 32 reps. So the changes that we're seeing here were over 32 reps, and that's quite important to consider because if we don't see changes in 3 reps, so their maximal strength, okay, that's fine. But if we see changes in over 32 reps, it's probably quite a big difference because maybe it highlights their ability to maintain their maximum power and to resist fatigue. And it might be similar to this kind of test, which has been administered in the literature and has shown to deviate from maximal strength. The future. So hopefully what we can conclude from this study and what we're trying to understand about flywheel training is that we don't know whether flywheel changes, so the different things that we've exposed here are related to performance. We don't know if they're related to strength. We don't know if they're related to injury. But that's probably something that we should try and focus on, something that we should try and target in the future. So we should try and see if there is this relationship. And we also want to try and understand if these hamstring exercises are completely transferable. So does a bilateral variation of flywheel training and a unilateral variation of flywheel training achieve the same outcomes? Our current conclusions or no? But it's not because fundamentally there is something wrong with the technology or something wrong with the concepts. It's just how we apply those concepts. It's just how we train those exercises. So overall conclusions, we want to achieve a greater intensity. We want to use a greater intensity when we're using unilateral exercises. We probably want to aim for a lower volume per session. Now this is very generic. We want to try and prolong training duration. Like I said, this is a very basic presentation. These are very basic concepts. But it's important to mention that actually these things can be the difference between you seeing a difference in the outcomes that you want and not seeing a difference in the outcomes that you want. That's it for me. If anyone wants to chat flywheel training, I'm more than happy to. And I hope this was useful in some way, shape, or form. Thank you.
So, I'd like to open the floor to any question, please. If you are interested in asking some big question, it's the moment. So, bad questions are accepted. We have also people in the audience that use Flywheel technology quite frequently. So, if you want to ask a question, you know that they are welcome. Okay. So, please, Alex.
Did you have any measures of muscle soreness throughout the study? Because I know that's one of the major complaints of the Nordic exercise in particular. I know that's why it's been scrapped across some pathways within federations and things like that. Just in terms of that, for me, flywheel training, major limitation is it could be only one at a time, for example, in a group setting or very small groups. But if I've got that leg up in terms of I can incorporate it in short time frames or short turnarounds in terms of matches because of that lack of muscle soreness.
Yeah, so muscle soreness I think would be something that really would have been interesting to measure. We didn't measure it, but from just the conversations that we had with the athletes that we had in, there was definitely a difference between the legs. It was really cool actually because I'd never done a study where we trained one leg and then didn't train the other. People, when I proposed it to them, were a bit like, I don't think so. And then you kind of had to sell it to them. But they definitely felt a difference in tightness. So, you know, even if you were to just do a stretch like that, you could feel the difference before you came in. In terms of soreness, I would say the initial sessions were probably the worst. These were all athletes who were familiarized with the flywheel. They were also familiarized with the bidex. So I think a lot of that, maybe repeated bout effect of the physiological phenomena that might happen the first time you train no longer occurred later on. When we increased the volume, so we went to 60 repetitions or whatever it was, there was definitely a lot more soreness because every repetition is maximal. And obviously that with the increased volume, it can be quite damaging, quite painful.
One of the things that we have seen in the past is generally familiarization improve after one session, but you need maybe a couple, and the soreness is generally present after the first session. After 2 sessions, 3 sessions is already much lower. So personally, something that we've seen. Any other follow-up? Any other questions from the audience? Alex?
I've no idea what you're talking about, but I'm really interested. You have 2 different sides, the researcher and the practitioner. I'm very interested in these type of results, how they translate or what impact they have when you apply them.
Well, to be honest, it kind of made me think a bit more about, you know, the way we periodize our training and, you know, what can we expect. There was another cool study that did something similar to what we did, but they actually trained, so they tested people on the bidex and the Nord board, and then they trained half the population on the Nord board and half the population on the bidex. And these are 2 exercises that are very similar in terms of the speed, in terms of the repetition, so they matched a lot of these things. And they found that people who trained on the bidex improved on the bidex, and people who trained on the Nord board improved on the Nord board, but not vice versa. And so this kind of reinforces that concept that you can train for something, but it needs to be specific to the outcome that you want. And if you train isometric strength, it won't probably transfer directly to eccentric strength. If you have a low baseline of everything, you're likely that things will improve. But if you're trying to help an athlete adapt to something, a stressor, you're going to need to train in and around that stressor as close as you can, simply put, I think.
Any other questions for the audience? So I have a question for you. So it is the next follow-up after that you've seen that we need them, say, longer duration, probably more focus on intensity and lower volume. From a periodization point of view, what is the next step from a research perspective, for example?
Post-doc, no more post-doc. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to consider, you know, this is one of the first studies that also combined a hip dominant and knee dominant stimulus. So a lot of the previous investigations did, only a bilateral leg curl, or they did a hip extension intervention. So I think combining things together, so looking at high-speed running with flywheel training, with a combination of maybe something else, could be really interesting, because at the end of the day, when we apply our practice, it's not in an individual, you know, specific point. It's using loads of other things. But with research, we have to control for loads of things, and in practice, we can't. So it's kind of difficult to manage the 2 of them. But I would say the next step would be to try and use this information to prepare another intervention and pair that intervention with something else. like a sprinting dosage once a week or twice a week, and seeing if those 3 things together have an effect. Obviously, we can't then discern and say, oh, it was flywheel training or sprinting. It was a combination of that, but we need to start selling things like packages when we work, because we don't work in silos. We don't just do gym training, or we don't just do running. We do everything.
Thank you, Kevin. If you have any other question, I would like to thank Kevin, and I will say some words to close the symposium, okay? So, thank you, Kevin.